Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Welcome to an event of the Brookings Doha Center on Algeria. It is safe to say that April has been a very eventful month in North Africa and across the region. On a more negative note, of course, we have seen the conflict in Libya erupt again, and we are currently seeing the consequences of it. But on a more positive note, in April, we've seen the removal of two authoritarian leaders who have ruled for decades in Algeria and in Sudan, who were removed following a historic wave of protests in both countries. Abdelaziz Bouteflika in Algeria stepped down on April 2nd, and Omar al-Bashir was ousted from power on the 11th of April, just a few days ago. All of this has happened, and it's not yet, and we are still yet in the first half of April. So one wonders what will happen by the end of the month. Of course, developments in Algeria and in Sudan have led to a rush of commentary over the past weeks on Arab Spring 2.0, and this is a continuation of 2011. And of course, this comparison is apt in a way because there's similar conditions led to the protests, of course, corruption, nepotism, an restive youth population yearning for change. But at the same time, there are very key differences between the case studies of Algeria, Sudan, and the Arab Spring. And we really need to understand each country within its own historical context, within its own contemporary context. And this is why we're having today's panel focusing solely on Algeria. So, how have the protests evolved in Algeria? What were the demands of the protesters? How did the government respond? How is the government likely to respond over the coming weeks? And fast forward to the future. When there is a new president of Algeria, he will deal with the same set of economic issues that currently exist. So how will future Algeria deal with these socioeconomic issues? And finally, what are the ramifications of these protests on North Africa and indeed on the region? So to answer these questions, we have assembled for you a fantastic panel today of experts on the Maghreb and on Algeria. And we are also proud that it's a gender-balanced panel, 2 for 2, following the BDC's efforts for inclusion and diversity. So before we jump in, I would like to introduce our panel. To my left, Dr. Dalia Ghanem is an Algerian resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where her work examines political and extremist violence, radicalization, Islamism, with an emphasis on Algeria. Ghanem is the author of numerous publications, including the recent piece in the New York Times, Another Battle for Algiers, and Limiting Change Through Change, the key to Algeria's regime's longevity. To her left, Dr. Yahya Zubeir, professor and director of research and geopolitics at the Kedge School of Business. Professor Zubeir's work on Algeria has focused on the nature of the rentier regime in Algeria and how it has been able to renew itself in major crises. He is the author of numerous books and volumes, including North Africa in Transition, State, Society, and Economic Transformation, and North Africa, Politics, Region, and the Limits of Transformation. To his left, Dr. Amal Abu Bakr is a research fellow at the EHESS School in Paris, and she was previously a dear colleague at the Brookings Doha Center. Her research focuses on the Maghreb country politics, Euro-Arab relations, and Islam in Europe, and she is the co-editor of Whatever Happened to the Islamists with Olivier Roy. And last but not least, Professor Mohammed Sharqawi, senior researcher at Al Jazeera Center for Studies and professor of conflict resolution at the George Mason University in Washington, D.C., and a former member of the United Nations panel of experts on Libya. He is also the author of numerous volumes, including What is Enlightenment, Continuity, or Rupture in the Wake of the Arab Uprisings. As per the usual Brookings Doha Center format for panels. Each of the speakers will have about 8 minutes to speak for some introductory comments, after which we will jump to discussion, which will be followed by questions and answers from the audience. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Dalia to start, please.
Thank you, Adel. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So 8 minutes is a bit too short to tell you everything about Algeria, but I'm going to focus on the protest. Why? Because I had the chance to attend the protest myself with my eyes as a political scientist, but also with my heart and my identity as an Algerian citizen. What are the main characteristics, if I may say, of the protest? So I went to Algiers and I marched with Algerians for the March 1st, which was one of the first biggest protests, and then March 22nd and March 29th. From the beginning, I knew that we were witnessing a unique event. It reminded me when I was there and I marched on March 1st, the protest in which my mother used to take me during the 90s to say no to terrorism. So the protest had four characteristics. The first one is what Algerians called silmiya, which means peaceful. And the protest was also hadariya, which means civic. And they were also akhawiya, brotherly. And they were wataniya, meaning they took up to all the national territory. So let us say that from March 1st to March 29th, I've seen the evolution of the demands. When we marched on March 1st, the demand was clear and focused. لا للعهدة الخامسة, meaning no to the fifth term. But it is the contempt and the disdain of the regime to the calls of the people that, one, gave birth to the protest, and two, broaden the demands of the protest. Because today, Algerians, despite Bouteflika stepping down, they are asking for more. They are asking, for instance, today for الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, which means the people want the departure of the regime. They are asking also for the departure of Chief of Staff Gaid Saleh. They are asking also for the departure of what they call the 3 Bs. The 3 Bs stand for Belaiz, Bedoui, and Ben Saleh. And as a matter of fact, an hour ago, the president of the Constitutional Council, Belaiz, resigned. So this is already 1 B that fell, and this is a second victory for the Algerian people. About the peaceful nature of the protest, I think this is something that really amazed Algerians themselves, but also amazed the world. Algerians took up to the street in a very civilized and peaceful way, and they succeeded in provoking the departure of their president after 7 weeks without 1 drop of blood being shed. And I think this is a beautiful lesson of peace, but it shows the political maturity of the Algerian people, in the sense that, when I was on the street with them and I talked to them, even those who were only 20 and 21, the memory of the Black Decade was still very present, even for the youngest one. And everyone was aware of the violence and how the circle of violence can, can drag the country into what the country witnessed during the 90s. So Algerians are very aware and cognizant of that, and they don't want to answer, for instance, of what we've seen a week ago with the provocation of the security forces. I mean, this is very political savvy people. I remember, for instance, from the first March, each time the protester would meet a security forces, a police barricade, they will, raise their hands to the sky, and they would start chanting Silmiya, Silmiya, peaceful, peaceful. They would also chant Sha'b Shurta Khawa Khawa, which means the police and the people are brothers. They would also chant Yala Police Ma Dirish Al-Aib, which means, oh police, do not do not sully and tarnish your reputation. So we are here in front of, you know, some political maturity, but also politically savvy people, and we cannot also ignore the fact that we are in front of a new generation that uses social media. Algeria has 19 million of Facebook users, and they do understood from a very early stage that Facebook is going to be their best weapon. To organize, to structure their movement, because one thing has also to be said about the movement. The popular movement is a leaderless movement. So until now, there is no leader of this movement. It is Algerian people who are organizing themselves. Yet, the movement has been structured and strategic. And I will end up on one question, which is, what's next? Taken up to the street every Friday has been, you know, successful to a certain extent. We have tangible objective that has been reached, with the first one, the departure of President Bouteflika, and the second one, the departure of Belaiz. But I do believe that we need to escalate in the sense to remain still peaceful, but now the movement needs to be more structured, and the movement actually needs to go further with civil disobedience. I think civil disobedience, meaning if the lawyers, if the judges, if the student, if the oil and gas worker, if all these people stop obeying orders and stop doing their work, then they will seriously handicap the system, the Bouteflika clan that is still, you know, behind the scene, and then they will push for the military to take more actions. And I will end on that, would be happy to answer the question.
Well, this was perfect timing, like a pro. Thank you very much. Emil?
Yeah, thank you to all the Brookings teams for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be back in Doha. Algeria's transition or model of transition is misleading. Since the beginning, people are asking me, but is that a revolution? And if so, why don't we have an overthrow of or why the people are not ready to overthrow the military? So what kind of framework can we apply to Algeria in order to understand the current movement? Where 10 years ago, political scientists and transitologists were mainly using the semi-authoritarian framework. That means that these countries and Arab countries, actually, not just Algeria, who have experienced civil conflict or missed opportunities to use the transition as a real trigger for democratization, and then establish a kind of governance that may look democratic on the surface, but at the same time, which is still very much controlled from the top. So in Algeria, for example, since Bouteflika has been in power, we have had sham elections, pluralist elections, okay, but still, again, very much controlled from the top. We have had a press that seems to be free, but at the same time had no real impact on the elite in power. We had also economic liberalization, but which has been conducted much more through the redistribution of the oil rent than on a real reform for social justice. So this has been the way we have used to understand Algeria and Algerian governance. Then came the Arab Spring, and we only had two models: either revolution, so basically the total disappearance of authoritarian states, or authoritarian restoration, as we may have seen it in Syria and somehow in Morocco and so on. And we forgot about Algeria, and we didn't know what to do about Algeria, or what to do of this transition that Algeria seemed to experience. And in my opinion, what we need to do in order to understand where Algeria is leading to is to think about the impact of this semi-authoritarian or face à démocratie, whatever the label may be, model. And this is how we can understand, in understanding the impact this semi-authoritarian model has had in Algeria for the past 10 years, we will understand two things. First, that semi-authoritarianism is not a stable form of regime. on the contrary to what has been written. It led to internal dysfunctions, and it led to new opportunity for the people to mobilize. And I will like to mention this internal dysfunction and these new opportunities for the people to mobilize in this paper. So we need to understand how Algeria has evolved. The protest didn't come out of the blue, as you may imagine. It's Algerians have accumulated a lot of techniques of resistance over the past 10 years, even since 1962 actually, and it passed on from generation to generation. And what is most important is that the preeminence of personal interest and personal predation among the Algerian elite for the past 10 years has actually led to an institutional and an ideological vacuum in the country. Elites were not interested in governing Algeria anymore. Even the president were not physically there. So this vacuum, this institutional and ideological vacuum that Algeria has been experiencing for the past 10 years has led Algerians to think that they could make it on their own, and that they could live without a president, and that they could live without a functioning state. And this is really what we have to understand in order to analyze why this protest emerged and how. So the key word currently in Algeria when it comes to the relationship between the people and the regime is really reappropriation. Reappropriation of political life, a political life that Algerians have been excluded from because elites were too busy focusing on negotiations between Bouteflika circles, the army and the secret services. So Algerians are really trying to reappropriate politics and not just to be invisible and to act as spectator of what state elites are negotiating. So reappropriation of the political life, reappropriation of national identity and nationalism. It was almost taboo for Algerians to talk about national identity and unity after the civil war. These protests have made Algerians being able to do so. And reappropriation of public space. Of course, you know that after the civil war, the deal was, okay, we will with the deal between, or the tacit deal, the informal deal between the Algerian and the army and the secret services was, okay, on the side of the Algerians, we are going to withdraw from public spaces. We won't make any demands for change, but at the same time, please don't repress us. And on the side of the Algerian army and the secret services, it was, okay, we will end the civil war officially, but we won't go to transitional justice. And this has had a major impact on the current blockade we are currently experiencing in Algeria. So reappropriation, and I think that what we are currently in Algeria, it's the opening of a new political cycle. It's an effort to renew political culture in Algeria, a political culture that won't exclude the people from official political life. And of course, it will take time, and it's a long process, but that's really what is at stake currently between the Algerian regime and the protesters currently. So I would like to maybe focus on three main lessons that Algeria can give to other Arab countries that are currently stuck in this semi-authoritarian kind of governance, and three lessons that show us how, when semi-authoritarianism failed, it provides a new opportunity for the people to mobilize. So first, the first lesson is that a depoliticized leadership actually leads to the death of propaganda. What do I mean by that? You know that when Bouteflika came in power in 1999, the idea was for the army to step back and to say that now we are going to have a civilian-led country, the army won't be active anymore, it will be some kind of democracy in progress. But with this depoliticization of the military leadership, then all the narratives that used to reinforce the state and the regime in power, like, for example, the fact that Algerians should be prevented to take the streets, otherwise it will lead to another civil war, the fact that the redistribution of the rent was far more than enough to keep Algerians quiet. Well, all these narratives actually disappeared and wasn't making an impact as strong as it was on Algeria during the 90s or the start of the beginning of the Bouteflika era. And we can see it in the protest. Algeria says, well, we are not afraid of another civil war, actually. We have been through that. And we know now that the army is in command. The army is really the main actor that is actually in charge of electing a president, of organizing the political life. And it may seem not that important, but for Algerians, having this nature of the Algerian regime clarified to that extent allowed them to take the streets and to direct their demands in a more clearer way than before. The second lesson that Algeria is giving us in terms of where do we head in after such a regime configuration is that when you block institutions, and especially representative institutions, as the Bouteflika and the army did so for the past 20 years. They blocked the parliament, the president was used to govern only through presidential decrees. Yeah, I'm going to conclude. So they blocked the political parties, they co-opted political opposition parties and so on. And then now they are totally blocked. They can't find any kind of people to talk to within the ranks of the regime in order to organize a transition. And the Algerian people become the mediator, not the army anymore. My last point is on the impact of transition without transitional justice. As I say, the deal between the army and the people was to say, we won't take the streets and you won't repress us. But with the idea that there could not be another civil war, especially because the army may be prosecuted and the secret service may be prosecuted if another civil war emerged, well then people on the streets are saying that you can't do anything against it because, as Dalia mentions it, we are silmy, we are peaceful. So this is really an important lesson. As a conclusion, I would say that the more important transformation that the relationship between the Algerian state and the Algerian people has experienced is the shift of paradigm. Now, it's not about a strong authoritarian power monopolizing the political life and sidelining the Algerians. It's about two parallel tracks, and we'll see how, for example, the Algerians have been refusing to recognize and to acknowledge the authorities of the ministers, of any kind of government and any kind of regime, member of the regime. So I believe that what we will see now, since the regime is not ready to negotiate at all, and since people are not ready to stop rebuilding this political culture of participation, but we'll see two parallel tracks of transition, and we are seeing that already. Algerian people, and I will conclude on that, are organizing every day local committees to deliberate, to discuss, to understand how they can organize their own elections for a National Constituent Assembly. And this is a new model that needs to be analyzed. Algeria matters again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ehe.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'd like to thank the Brookings Doha for the kind invitation. It's always hard to come after two speakers who had more or less a similar presentation. However, and I've been asked to talk a little bit more about the economy, but in the Algerian case, you cannot delink the two from the political situation, precisely because the regime has based, since before, well, after independence, on two pillars. That is its legitimacy, revolutionary legitimacy, and the second one is the energy redistribution. That is the hydrocarbons, in other words, a rentier state. And so, these are the two elements that have helped the regime in renewing itself and maintaining itself in power. We'll get to more of that. Because I'm older than the two friends here, there is something that has happened that makes the Algerian uprising, the current, I would not call it uprising, but the demonstrations, different from the Arab Spring, different from even 1988, when we had the first Algerian uprising, the first Algerian Spring, if you wish, although some others would argue that the first Algerian Spring was in 1980 with the Berber uprising. There is one thing that has happened that, in my view, is very hard to decipher for the new generation, which basically impressed me in the movement, in the sense that if you asked Algerians 10 years ago, or you talked to them about the legitimacy, revolutionary legitimacy, they would say, forget this, forget that. What happened, which is absolutely critical to understand, is the linkage that this youth is making with the Algerian Revolution. That, I think, is fundamental to understand how they delegitimize the regime. If you look at during the protests, you would see the framework of Bouteflika empty, and then you have the framework with the pictures of some famous Algerian revolutionaries like Arabi Ben Mehdi, like Mustafa Ben Boulaid, and others. That, I think, is a great message. The second important message that I think has to be taken into account is the content. I had written on the Arab Spring. I did even a book on that, but I did not see much of political messages as strong as what we have seen in the Algerian case. It started with rejecting a fifth term for Bouteflika, and we'll get to that, and the concept of dignity. Anybody who does not understand the Algerian psyche has not understood anything. If you look at the whole history since 1830, the Algerians can be quiet for a while and then they rebel. The French celebrated in 1930 the 100th year of colonization, la colonisabilité de l'Algérie, and so on and so forth, and then boom, you have another one. So now I get to the sort of the economy in a sense, because the economy has not, in this particular case, has played less of a role. But if we look at what has happened in terms of the economy, Bouteflika had basically built his legitimacy on the national reconciliation that you mentioned, and although I would dispute that, because the national reconciliation began well before him with Zerwal in 1994 with the Rahma policy and so on and so forth. But he was able, you know, he's a good communicator, and he was able to do that. So that was some form of legitimacy. But also Bouteflika benefited from something that no other president had, which means $1 trillion, you know, in revenues from the oil, and was able to redistribute some of the rent to the population and to keep this facade of socialist policies. Now, if we want to understand, because you were suggesting in your email to me, you know, the economy as a trigger. As I said, in 1988, it was very obvious. If you looked at if you analyzed the Algerian revolts of 1988, you would see it very clearly. 1986, the price of the barrel goes down, and not long after, you know, there's purchasing power was down, and so on, and that triggered, you know, although from my perspective, there were also fissures, some fractures within the regime itself between those who wanted some reforms and those who did not. You know, some sort of liberalism, and here we can bring up, you know, Hamrouche and others who were really favorable to a sort of new system. But what Bouteflika did, he was a sultan, you know, in the political sense of the term. In other words, he is the power figure, the only one, and you have all these cronies around him, and they serve him at his own, you know, privilege. See, you know, and so, but he used that as a patronage system, clientelist system, you know, with the predation that Amel was talking about earlier. So these were some of the. But I think to understand what's going on today, what triggered the whole thing, you have to look at the performance of the fourth mandate. The fourth mandate were false promises. If you do an analysis of everything that was promised, so I can go on a few. The project, you know, the 5-year plan, you know, was talking about a growth, a GDP growth of 7%. That was not achieved. That was, in 2014, the GDP growth was 3.8%, but it ended up being 1.4% by 2018. So now, in that sense, you are right. You know, it could have been one of the factors, but it was not the only factor in this particular case. Unemployment. I had studied the youth in the whole Euro-Mediterranean region, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya. And of course, you can see the grievances that the youth had, you know, and so migration, and it was very difficult. They were risking their lives, or terrorism. And then when they stopped joining the groups because, you know, the security forces were able to quell that, then so there was something totally new. And so we can talk about the youth and the lack of, of employment. The unemployment in Algeria was 10.6% in 2014, and recently it was 12.3% in 2018. So for first, all these promises, but of course, you know, they say Bouteflika made the promises. We don't know whether Bouteflika was, you know, even aware of his surroundings. The Algerian dinar had lost its value by basically 50% between 2014 and 2018. In relation to the dollar, which means that the food prices, you know, went up, and of course the cost of living also followed suit. So the prices, if you are talking about prices between 2014 and 2018, the prices rose by 26.4%. And the salaries remained constant. So, which means that the purchasing power of the population went down and continues to this day, because I think you talked about the transition. Now we have to talk eventually about the economic transition, what's going to happen with this economic situation where we have all these issues going on. You know, there is still a problem of housing. Bouteflika had promised 1 million, you know, housing, you know, for people and so on and so forth. But the regime did not take into account, you know, the growth, the demographic growth, and so on and so forth. And there has not been any improvement in that sense. The youth, as I said, still facing these problems. And they face also the problem of housing, and that has not been addressed by Bouteflika. And if you add to this, because the youth is watching what's going on with the regime, and the kids of the regime, you know, getting better, you know, and so on and so forth. And while the people, again, their situation getting worse, and worse. You look at the health sector, it's deplorable. The health sector is deplorable, and then you have, you know, the dignitaries of the regime taking their wives to give birth in clinics overseas, and so on and so forth. So that, you know, the Algerians there is one concept that I think most scholars have not understood, is the concept of the hogra. The Algerians don't like bullying. They don't like this injustice. There is one thing: you can do whatever you please to an Algerian. You don't touch his dignity. You don't, you know, show injustice towards an Algerian. There are also some other disparities between the north and the south, you know, in terms of development and so on. And there we have seen some revolts in the south in particular. So that was something new. And I think when you talk about the economy in Algeria, you have to deal with this business sector, which is not a productive sector. These are predators. You know, this business community that was one of the pillars or one of the elements of the Bouteflika regime. So Bouteflika has left, and his cronies are leaving Algeria in a very, very sad situation. Did I go over 8 minutes?
Perfect timing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think what we've heard so far really complements each other in terms of the political drivers of the protests, and also the economic ones, who are very, very interrelated, and we can't really separate them. So in our panel, we actually have 3 Algerians sitting right next to me, and we have a Moroccan on the far left. And I think Dr. Mohamed Sharkawi can also give us really what the Algerian protests mean for the region, for North Africa, and for the Arab world. What are the regional consequences of such protests? Please, Dr. Mohamed.
Thank you, Adil. I'm delighted to be part of this event hosted by Brookings Doha Center, and I also commend you for striking some balance between the Middle East and North Africa. So since we talk about Algeria today, I feel like the Maghreb has some significance in the final analysis. Earlier you mentioned that this panel has some good gender balance. Let me see if I can bring some language balance. Since we are in Doha, I switch to Arabic. أنا باحث في
I am a researcher in the mechanisms of political and social change, and I'm interested and concerned with what's happening in Algeria, Sudan, and Libya, and the rise of the General Haftar's role now that he got his legitimacy in the east to impose his control over the western part of the country. So what happened between the end of March and between the beginning the month of April? These momentous changes, Algeria is in turmoil now, Sudan, Libya. So this makes me wonder, what can the Algerian situation inform us of in view of other previous experiences, whether in Syria between March 2011 and September 2011, when the political movement moved from peacefulness to violence, and then what happened in Libya when the balance of power was broken, and in Yemen also between the legitimate government forces and the Houthi rebels. Now I'll focus a little bit in my comparison on the Algerian situation. For students of political sciences, may wonder, do we have new analytical tools which differ from what we had or what we used in 2011? I'll start by posing this wide-ranging question. Is the scene in Algeria reflecting any kind of change, whether we call it a revolutionary change or an Arab Spring style change or changing the regime? Are we faced with a popular uprising similarly to 2011, whether on Mohammed al-Khamis Street in Tunisia or Tahrir Square in Cairo and other main Arab cities? Or are we talking about a higher level, and that is a demand for the total change of the political regime? This is what's been happening now at the hands of Algerians compared to what the Egyptians, Yemenis, Syrians, and Libyans have called for or did. Or is it a kind of an opposition of an attempt by the regime which managed to impose its will by changing the face or the head figure of the regime, and therefore find a so-called a constitutional solution? And have we, in the Algerian situation, got to the stage where we are touching upon the revolutionary stage? I will come back to this later on. Also, the importance of the Algerian event, and my colleagues have talked about different mechanisms. Dr. Yahya spoke about the economic side. All of this is a kind of popular agitation which emanates from the demands by the marginalized section of society. So what is the context now? Is the Algerian context different than other Arab contexts, or are we, after all, faced with the same changes and the same causes? I don't think we will end up with the same consequences. I have a few suggestions I will talk about. The first irony is the Algerian street is showing now what the Tunisian, Egyptian, and Syrian streets could not show or did not show. Especially so that in Tahrir Square, all they were chanting and shouting, calling for the downfall of the head of the regime. And when that happened, everybody sang the song that the people and the army are together, and the army and the people are hand in hand or standing shoulder to shoulder. The Algerian scene seems to inform us of a different perspective. Now we see what can call the rational stage, whereby the popular agitation continues its leverage and pressurizing and keeping to its peacefulness. I hope that we will stay like this until we get to the third stage, which is the strategic stage. What we're seeing now is similar to an Algerian as of an agora, Greek agora, when the decision makers and people and their representatives used to debate between them, and eventually this produced what we know now as democracy. So at the same time, having said that, we notice that the Algerian street has rejected even the selection of the president of the Constitutional Council, and the question is now, will the army stick to its traditional role, or will they try not to lose their grip on power? And my worst fear is maybe the military will stage manage some events of violent nature, which will take us back to the late 80s and the army presenting itself as the savior from civil war. But I can't help noticing that the protests now are calling, the people are calling for political demands which go beyond the constitution, what I can call a post-constitutional era as a driver for change. This means that what we know as constitutional legitimacy, and we know the Article 1 or 2 others, what the Algerian people seem to want is reject this partial, half-baked measures. They want to restore legitimacy, but not by recycling the old regime or the incumbent regime, but through the legitimacy of the people. Despite my optimism, we cannot, in the case of Algeria, say that the popular agitation movement would not produce a political elite. I don't think. What we're noticing now is this popular legitimacy is trying, through the contribution of some political actors and some figures of the opposition and the Algerian civil society. I think the Algerian civil society now is doing a lot more than any other civil society in the Arab countries of before. They are acting rationally and they are engaged in a kind of push and pull between them and the regime. The regime trying to come up with solutions to recycle itself, and the people are wise enough and politically savvy enough to reject that. Now, if we take a look at the situation from Algeria to Egypt, we will find a scene in Sudan which is totally different than all of this. The army jumping to power, which is different than all of this. And in Libya, now when you see Haftar now meeting Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, and presenting himself and depicting himself as, I am a very powerful figure, I am the one who rules on the ground. This brings us to a line of demarcation between two different political worlds, which we call the Arab world. I can safely say that there is no longer an Arab world, and there is no a Magharibi Arab world or North Africa with 5 countries. There are 3 countries there, and in Algeria we do not know what will happen. In Morocco there will certainly be a political movement. In other words, the Arab Magharibi countries or North African countries are presenting us with a new model for change and comprehensive change, whereby a civil state is being born, and vis-a-vis that in the rest of the Arab world is some projects of political change, but they keep ending up on a collision course with the military. Started that with Sisi in Egypt in 2013. We saw that in Syria one way or another. We saw that in Yemen, because the language of arms is what the politicians hide behind. Even the peace talks in Stockholm do not bear fruit, because those who rule control the reins of power. In brief, in a nutshell, I say, we look towards North Africa, we see the civil track. In Sudan and Egypt, there is a military track. So the pertinent question is, can these two worlds converge, or have we said goodbye finally, and the train has departed in 2 different lines, or heading towards 2 different destinations? In the Algerian case in particular, maybe we can say that the North African countries are known to be peaceful, moderate, and taking the middle path. On the 14th of January, and the army did not interfere. Rashid bin Ammar was politically wise. I hope this time round that what happened with Rashid bin Ammar in Tunisia, when he didn't interfere, his Algerian counterparts do the same, because whether we're talking about the eastern or the western wings of the Arab world, we really need to make a movement towards a new century. Otherwise, we remain stagnant in political tribalism. If we do not use knives, we will resort to guns this time round.
Interesting points on the polarization that is ongoing right now in the Arab world. And how certain regimes, be they military regimes, have a different view of civil-military relations whatsoever, and how the military can, at the end, sort of upend any potential transition towards civilian rule. I guess my first question to the panel, Dalia made a very interesting comment on a leaderless movement. So a leaderless movement is actually a very good movement, because in one way, because it's very hard to get to arrest the leader of the movement, but also it makes things very difficult for transition because people are unable to coalesce around a certain, around a leader or a number of leaders. So in the Algerian case, I want to know a bit more about who the opposition is on the streets, and beyond the demands for the 3 Bs are now the 2 Bs to step down, who on the street has the potential to lead this movement moving forward? Dr. Yahya?
Yeah. Well, it's not unusual not to have leadership in a movement, at least in its inception. And we have seen it in Egypt, in Tunis. In Tunisia, it was virtual, basically. Nobody knew who was behind, the social media and so on. But eventually, I think what is clear in the movement in Algeria, although there is no real leadership as such, but the idea is germinating. In other words, you know what you do not want. You know that people refuse to have the old cronies of the people that they have seen around for a long time. However, I don't think, I did the transitology business in the 1980s because I was one of the most optimistic about Algeria in 1988, thinking that after that we could have a negotiated pact towards a real transition, democratic transition. But what is happening today, I think either there is a fracture in the military, which has happened in other places, or the military itself. Because if you look at the nature of the Algerian military, and many people tend to focus on some of the rotten chiefs of the military, but the military as an institution is not as bad as one might think because it has been professionalized. If there is one positive thing that has happened in the last 15, 20 years is the professionalization of the military. The reason why you have this khawa is that, the military, well, after during the civil unrest, or some people call it civil war of the 1990s, the military has been able to regain a positive image among the people. If you look at the Arab barometer, all these analyses, one of the most trusted institutions in Algeria is the military. Whether we like it or not, and the troops are part of that, of the people, and so on and so forth. There is also, and I'll ask my dear friends here whether they agree, even the political opposition has been rejected. In other words, there is no hope that this leadership or the party that would negotiate with whoever in the regime, because within the regime there are some decent people who were just, officials who were working within the institutions and so on and so forth. So unless we have this kind of at some point, even the population or the demonstrators, the protesters, and what's going on, by the way, I'll open in parentheses, what's going on in the university. They had killed the university as a producer of intellect, of ideas. Now we see the university coming back in providing its real role. In other words, the role of ideas that Mohammed was talking about, aqliyan and so on and so forth. Some ideas that are coming and how we can organize a transition. So there is that possibility of finding whether, in fact, there is I don't know if you have seen it, there is already a list that the people had put. They put Jamil Abu Hirid, one of the revolutionaries, as a symbolic president and so on. But I think we will end up with some sort of triumvirate, some committee, and there will be some forces that are willing to come together. But unless there is that willingness to make the transition into, whatever it might be, hopefully a democratic transition, then we're still in a stalemate. And like Amal suggested, we have two opposing forces. The people are saying, we don't want to deal with the old guard of the regime, and the regime is saying, there are limits in how much I'm going to allow to happen without risking to sink. So that's where we are. Please.
Yeah, I think there could be a middle way, actually. Well, first, if the fact that there's no leadership doesn't mean that there's no coordination. People, the Algerian people, are really coordinated throughout social networks, but also during the whole week, because we don't have demonstrations only on Friday. The whole week is an opportunity, and especially the Tuesday, as you mentioned, is the day of the students' demonstrations. And the whole week is an opportunity for the Algerians to brainstorm, to think about what they want. And what they want, actually, in terms of transition, is quite clear. They want first some leaders, some names that you mentioned, not to lead the country. This will emerge from a transparent and democratic election, but they want these people to supervise the transition, to be able to control the institutions, to be able to put pressure on the regime elite and the army in order to accept this transition to be clear and transparent. So these names, these roles will be much more about supervising the transition, and they have credit, they have credibility to do so, and we know these names, and they are quite they make there's a consensus within Algerian society about them. But again, there's an effort to brainstorm on what we can do to control the transition, to not lose the control of the transition. And then what they want is quite clear. They want a national constitutional assembly. Yes. They don't want, as you mentioned, to conduct any kind of transition within the current constitutional framework, which has been so distorted that it doesn't make any sense for the people and does not represent the people. So I believe that we should not focus on the issue of leadership as such, but much more on how the role will be redistributed between civil society, people who will be able to supervise the transition, and how then the reform of the institutions recreate de facto a new leadership.
Mohammed, you had a comment?
باختصار يعني انتقل ابني على نفس الفكره وعند الدكتور يحيى ايضا. اذا عدنا الى الوراء خطوتين او ثلاثه وحاولنا ان نقرا المشهد الجزائري الان على مستوى التنسيق، يبدو ان ربما المشهد الجزائري اكثر من كل المشاهد العربيه الاخرى يساعد في الرد على التساؤل المطروح منذ عام 2011. مما نتحرر والى اين نتحرر؟ freedom from freedom to كما طرحها إيمانويل كانت حفيد النظرية الحداثية أو من ألهم على الأقل 200 ثورة وقعت منذ نهاية القرن الثامن عشر. فأعتقد أننا كنا منغمسين كعرب كمصريين كتونسيين ويمنيين وسوريين بنوع من الهروب من هذا النظام. إذا freedom from كانت هي الهم الأساسي. الآن ننتقل بعد 8 سنوات إلى المشهد الجزائري، حيث أن أصبح أيضا تدقيق إلى أين نتحرر freedom to. فالآن أعتقد أن هناك أصوات نقدية أو عندها حس نقدي خلال التجاذب السياسي مع البوفوار، مع السلطة، مع الجيش، مع البرلمان، أنه في نهاية المطاف ينبغي أن نكون واثقين إلى أين تتحرك هذه الماكينة السياسية. فأعتقد يمكن القول أننا أيضا من ناحية الفكر السياسي الشعبي على مستوى القاعدة أصبحنا في المستوى الثاني، على خلاف لما كنا في الريتش والصيف أيام 2011. فبدأنا نرى شوية نور ونتنفس شوية ديال العقلانية، أنه لا نقبل الأمور برمزيتها، وإن كان هناك خطاب رمزي لكن فيه نوع من الحذر حتى من بعض الرموز نقترب منها، لكن إذا كانت تقدم يعني إضافة أو قيمة مضافة في تحريك
mobilizing the streets in a rational way. I believe that the Egyptian scenario is what actually scares the Algerian people, and I believe this comparison is behind this new awareness to mobilize the process in a careful way and not to go back into the brace of the army.
To bit differ from my colleagues here, and I'm going to say that it is true that the movement has been able to organize and they have been successful at doing so. However, every movement, every popular movement is in a way condemned to fade away. We've seen in the US, for instance, with the protest for the Wall Street protest. We've seen, for instance, the bulldozer revolution, while at the beginning the revolution was very powerful and the protester wanted only the fall of Slobodan Milosevic. After the fall of Slobodan Milosevic, the revolution faded away. So I would say that the question of leadership is in a way important, because we need at a given moment to ask this question: for how long Algerians are going to take up to the street every Friday on a and every week. For how long they are going to resist, you know, عمليات الاستفزاز, يعني the provocation of the regime. So I would suggest that we need a minimum of institutionalization. It is true that not having a leader is a good and smart way to do it. As you said it, by not having a leader, we cannot have a leader jailed, but we cannot also have a leader co-opted, because this is what the Algerian regime does. It co-opts people the same way it co-opted the opposition, for instance. So a minimum of institutionalization of the movement would mean, for instance, we keep the movement structured, but we keep it decentralized, in the sense that this has been a national movement, right? And calls have been launched on Facebook. But we need now to reach a point where every locality, every baladia, as we said it, every small town in Algeria is capable to organize its own civil disobedience or its own demonstration, and to answer national calls to take up to the street every Friday. Because let us be, you know, we want to be optimistic, but we need to be realistic. Until when Algerians are going to resist? Last Friday, we've seen, for instance, the first strategies of, you know, of provocation. We've seen some kind of violence used in the street against peaceful protesters. We've seen also hacking operations on Facebook. There is 2 big pages on Facebook that are called L'Algérie debout and L'Algérie ne brûlera pas. Algeria is not going to be burned, and yet the regime has been, you know, trying to hack these. The regime has always, you know, tried to play on the sensitive strings, which are regionalism in Algeria. So for the moment, people are vaccinated against that, if I may say. But again, we need to think popular movement tends to fade away.
You don't have a leader.
Yes, yes.
Okay, if I may say,
please.
I do agree totally. But what I
نعم أنا أتفق اتفاقا كاملا، لكن هناك حركة
suggestions, Bouchachi, Abdel Noor, an old man, you know. But what I was saying, the movements do start sometimes without leadership. Where we agree is, if it continues like the Gilets jaunes, you know, that may a point where you need to have a force. But you have to look at it also from the other side, that it may also fracture. There have been, you know, what happened historically in these transitions is that sometimes within the armed forces, or this is the experience of Latin America and so on and so forth, when they started having, you know, a negotiated pact, where you put the military back into the barracks, you pay the rotten ones, you give them, you know, some companies to run and things like that, like they did in Brazil, you know, which was governed by the military for a long time, but it did make its transition to a democratic society.
Yeah, I mean, I agree definitely that army fracture is one potential scenario, but the other potential scenario is an increase in repression. And to the government's credit, I think the initial response was actually, it was a peaceful uprising, as you mentioned, and the response from the government has been very measured. But I think over the past week, this has been slightly changing, and there has been an increase in repression.
Yes,
I would like to ask the panel, perhaps starting with Dr. Mohammed, about this increase in repression, and is it the way forward? Is it the potential response of the government to crush the protests?
Well,
go ahead.
The repression is nothing new, actually, in Algeria. Since the start of the movement, for example, the first Algerian guy who called out for demonstrating against the fifth mandate, Haj Gharmoul, is still in prison. He has been put in jail in February, and he's still in prison. And there's an important element that is quite new, actually, in Algeria, and it's the direct consequence of how Bouteflika has blocked, as I was mentioning earlier, the institutions, is the role of the judges. Judges have declared, for example, recently that they will refuse to supervise the elections. So there's and for a semi-authoritarian regime like Algeria, not having this judicial legitimacy, not having the legitimacy of the law, even in a facade one, is quite important. So repression is nothing new. People but there's something that prevent or that somehow protect people from repression is to be 1 million together in the streets. So there are protests everywhere in Algeria, even as you said, localized protests have already occurred, but they are much more easily targeted than the millionaire that Algerians have been mentioning. So the role of the judges and the judiciary will be crucial in the next steps.
Okay.
نقطتان بشكل سريع.
Two important points. The Algerian scene now is recalling another idea, and that is what governs this phase is not the strength of this party or that. So neither it's the people on the street, nor is it some generals who want to keep their grip on power. What's new is what I call the relativism, and through the civil relations, the relations between what's civil and what is military, we as researchers and analysts should pay more attention to this. The popular movement will continue because there is always the will to resist by the people and the will by the military to want to keep its control over power. Whether we're talking about the political, economic, or social aspect, we cannot ignore the external factor. I think the French role will be leading, especially in trying to when the French now want to see what will happen to their interests with the army, the military junta, with the Bouteflika inner circle and others. Although the people want change, but there are powers and countries want to protect the deep state. So therefore, the support for the financial or not, Khalifa Haftar did not decide to march on the West only after he visited Riyadh and the UAE and got their support and the support of France. And maybe somebody in Algeria will start thinking along these lines, and maybe some outside powers would want to invest in some general or other, so therefore the external factors will be
We should include our audience now with some questions. If we can get some audience questions for the last. Please, gentlemen. Adel Hamzaya, please, at the front here.
There was a lady.
Yeah. Can we have a mic, please?
Did you have a question?
حبيت تحضر؟
No?
He has a comment.
A comment.
Huh?
He decided that you had a comment.
حبيت تحضر؟
السلام عليكم. السلام عليكم. Thanks, under duress, Adel, very kind of you. I was going to keep quiet, so now you're going to have to tell me to shut up. Thanks very much for wonderful insights. Like two of my colleagues, or three of my colleagues, also an Algerian, British Algerian. I actually landed in Algeria early February, before everything had started, expecting 6 months of quiet, analyzing something which we should have mentioned, which is the informal sector, and how that has grown and is, like Egypt, 50–60% of the population, representation, taxation, nexuses, blah, 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 blah. A few comments, just a few quick questions, perhaps. Yahya, I think you were very generous with the unemployment rates. Official unemployment rates. Unofficial, you shabab, we're talking 30s, 40s, quasi-formality, formal on a Monday, informal on Tuesday, and so on. Amel's points on the social movement and the professions taking it to the next level. I agree with you on all of them but one, and that is Sonatrach. The moment you start playing with the golden goose, the lifeblood of the economy, we're in real trouble. The military and Sonatrach, for me, I think we really have to be very careful with how we play that. Qatar, UAE, the whole situation, Dolphin pipeline still flowing. in a world of multiple producers, the moment you start playing with your status as a reliable energy supplier, you have a problem. Along with the population dynamics, 1988 we were 25 million, today we're 43. Social contract expired about 10 years ago, but the $1 trillion that we accrued, well, over the time we've saved 200 billion. We're now 70 billion, similar to Saudi, 750 billion, down to 450 billion. So there's diminishing returns, both in terms of revolutionary legitimacy, but also the rent distribution. So there's less to go around. And that is a key driver, along with the humiliation of having a portrait as somebody who runs us. A couple of small big picture things that I'm thinking here is we haven't heard about the role of the Islamists in all of this. I think we'd like to hear a mention. After Salatul Jum'ah, for the last few weeks from the late February, when things started, there's a political maturity even amongst our conservative bearded brothers who after Salatul Jum'ah would not go out Bilganadar or Thobes, but they would go out in the night tracksuit or the Adidas tracksuit. Having said that, in recent weeks, you have heard more Islamist chants. Some of them are organic. We hear of also provocations and embedded autonomy when it comes to some of this. Another point is when thinking about countries like Libya and Iraq and their transitions, de-Baathification or Libya of the political isolation law, we really need to think about the role of the diaspora when it comes to technocrats, but also how far you go when digging down the ministries and purging. So I think that's really, I think, depicting the anatomy of where we go with this purge and how far you go, because it can become very dangerous very quickly, and you do need a character to run a country, even if there are rotten elements. And the big sort of final question when you're thinking out loud with these sorts of things is really, we have the uber corrupt, and some of them have been on travel bans and some of them are in prison, but there's also those who are just operating in a corrupt system. And I'd argue Rashwa has become, from top to bottom, an ever-present issue in society. So, you know, what are we talking about here? But food prices well taken. Are we competing with Sudan? The role of Russia, China contracting 90% arms imports, and our energy supplies in Italy and France wanting stability. There are many millions of questions, and I told you not to start me off. So
fantastic. Well, I think
I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Adil. Fantastic set of questions and issues that require another panel. But I'll perhaps go back to the panel for the first round. And I know
there's a lady who's been asking.
Where in the back? Please, yeah, another question in the back here first. 1 second. We'll take that question in the back. We'll take for one from this side, and it goes this side now.
Yeah, take a couple of them.
Thank you very much for very insightful presentations. I would like to ask a question. So, concerning a notion that was brought up, the reappropriation of political life. So, how do you think
can you please repeat
parties?
That? Sorry? Repeat that. Sorry, we couldn't hear.
So, the reappropriation of political life.
Reappropriation of political life.
Yeah, that was brought up in the panel. How can political parties access the political arena, and if the opposition does manage to gain political authority, do you think that the Algerian people that is now more skeptical than ever, do you think that it will have faith in these new political parties? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have another question? One there in the back, it's gentleman. Yes, please. A final question. Sorry. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, thank you for your interventions. I have two questions that I would like to ask. I'll ask the first one in Arabic, and the second one will be in English. سؤالي الأول الذي أود طرحه أوجهه إلى الأستاذ الفاضل.
For Mr. Al-Sharqawi. My first question that I would like to ask Mr. Al-Sharqawi, who wondered about the comparison, differences, the similarities between the movement in Algeria and the Arab Spring. And my question is, don't you think that what's happening in Algeria is a collapse of a regime that based itself on revolutionary legitimacy, especially the new generation doesn't define itself with the revolutionary ideology, and those channels the new generations were liberated from. That takes me to the other one.
In Algeria, it is my belief that the role of the elite in Algeria has been passive aggressive. It has been descriptive. I don't think that the elite in Algeria is supposed to describe. I believe they are supposed to prescribe and to lead, because I share the belief that these popular movements fade away. And I have been in Algeria when the protests were taking place. I've seen people from all walks of life expressing themselves, but they need somebody else to take over. They need somebody else to articulate their demands in plans. So my question is this: what do you think that the elite should do to secure this achievement?
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much. I think there's a number of questions that were raised, from civil-military relations to economic questions to the role of the Islamists, which I know you wrote a paper on. So I think we should give a chance to our panel to reflect on the questions, starting from Dr. Sharqawi.
Okay, I'll take the last question.
I'll take the last question. Your question takes us back to the discourse of the 70s, the Marxist, the Lenin discourse, and I don't believe that we can go back to this revolutionary imagination, but I believe that what we can do is a one step forward. Bern took a faster track of what we were in 2011 and to what happened in Tunisia, to Syria. There is no doubt that the Arab regime has passed away, but we delayed the barrier of this Arab dead body. Why am I saying that? I believe that the beginning of the 90s and after the Iraq invasion or invasion of Kuwait and the role, the weak role of the Arab League. All the Arab capitals came up with different positions. For the Arab League, it took 1 week for it to come up with a position. And I said that I believe in one of the interviews, I said that this is an evidence that there is no Arab role. We have to throw away the Arab discourse. I believe saying for Youssef al-Marzouk, the former Tunisian president, when he said that the Arab regime passed away. What I'm seeing now are many dynamics, many local dynamics are asking for change and building their demands on similar scenarios, employment, social boredom, and Algerians, like other Arab countries, they don't believe in their countries and their regimes and even their languages. There is a huge psychological harm, but this base foundation for change also vary from based on the parties, on the players, and the dynamics between the centers of powers, and how did they lose their shine because of local powers. I believe that the Algerian streets is a revolutionary bulldozer that pushes towards the demolishing of the deep state or the regime. So what we are looking now, are we at a point is what post the Arab Spring? Did we leave the general to the private? Will Algeria bring up something that the other regimes, Syria and Yemen and Egypt and other regimes didn't bring? We have to leave the saying or description of the Arab Spring. There are local projects for change. They may intertwine, but they have their own, they will have similar objectives. We are not about to measure the power authority of different dynamics in the society, like the army. We have to pay attention. How can these factors interact with each other based on what's local and what's on common and regional?
Yeah, your question on political recognition, I believe you focus on the role of the parties in these processes. Well, actually,
representativeness that will be based only on the moment of voting for a party, that will be based only on the momentum of elections, is a model that is in crisis, not only in Algeria, but worldwide. I'm Algerian, but I'm also French, and I can tell you that in France, nobody is voting anymore. And the only parties who have been able to mobilize public opinion in France are the parties who are using extreme right propaganda. And in the case of Algeria, propaganda doesn't work anymore. People are fed up of propaganda and nationalist discourses that the power has been using only to put its grips on the state. But what do they want in order to regain political culture is not only about the role of the parties, I'm sure you're aware of that, but what they want in terms of renewing their political culture is reappropriating the institutions. And what is going on in Algeria, and that takes me to your question mostly, it's on the depoliticization, or the fact that the Algerian people should not be ready to accumulating all this experience to transcribe it into an institutional one. Actually, in Algeria, all people are trying to learn about the constitution. When the Article 102 was brought up, all people were trying to understand what the constitution is saying about the distribution of power, the role of the president, the role of the people, and so on. So this is a moment that has an accelerating that is accelerating the politicization of Algeria very much so, but not just at the level of propaganda and anecdotes and so on, but really in terms of better knowing their institutions, their functioning in order to get their state back. Yeah, that's pretty much answering your question on the role of the elite. I know that I will talk about it, but I have worked a lot on the Islamist movements, and the opposition parties and the legalized Islamist parties have been ousted from the demonstrations. You know that. Symbolically, only Ali ibn Hajj, the former leader of the Islamic Salvation Front, is getting some legitimacy, not because he's an Islamist, but because he's repressed by the regime, and especially security forces, and monitored closely and so on. But apart from that, the re-Islamization of the Algerian society, which is something that has been real and true, that has really occurred, especially in the last 20 years, is to be seen not in the framework of the parties, but much more in, for example, how people were getting to the Friday prior to Friday demonstration, and then starting the demonstrations. Well, there's a taboo now that has fed away. People are not waiting the Friday prior to start demonstrations. So it's also the sign that there is a great feminization of the Algerian society, but it's not convicted, or it's not understood in terms of ideological challenge to get or to attain power and to get elections.
Yes, Adam, you're absolutely correct. I understated the unemployment, because if you look at the unemployment among the youth, it's about 45%. I gave you the official statistics, but the point was these are the promises of the fourth term, when the propaganda of the regime is that if we stay, we deserve to stay because we provide and so on, and then you look at the figures and you say, no, you haven't done any of that. What you talked about the informal sector, I don't know whether you're referring to the youth. The youth is a means of survival. There is one point, the gentleman who talked about the elite. Are you Algerian? Okay. In the 1980s, when you talked about the 1980s, during the shortages of Algeria, you know what the slogans were in the stadiums? Because the stadiums were the fora of contestation in Algeria, sports events. They used to say, ما نسحقوش ملك، ما نسحقوش في الفلكان، نسحق وراء إسفل. That was the 1980s. This was the slogan. Seriously, in the sports events. So your point is very well taken. But today what has changed? We have a picture. So if you give, the Algerians are not opposed to a strong leader. they are opposed to a corrupt leader like Bouteflika has been. Bouteflika has institutionalized. I published this in the early years of Bouteflika, in 2008, 2009. You know, he has institutionalized corruption. And the whole society is also guilty of that corruption, because the whole society became almost the image of the regime itself involved in corruption. So I'm not getting into that. The Islamist is my baby also. I like to talk about Islamism. Islamism, if you like to talk about, the Islamists have suffered in Algeria after the 1990s and the end of it. First of all, they have been also, one of the successes of the regime have been to fragment the political parties, the Islamist political parties. Because the regime learned its big lesson from the 1990s or the 1980s, it did not want another Islamic Salvation Front. Because the Islamic Salvation Front was different from the other parties in the sense that the party wanted a change of regime. It was a very radical party, which was not made up only of Islamists, as you probably know. It was a front. However, the regime has been able to tame the Islamist parties. And if you look at the electoral results of the Islamists, they have been down. And now I go with Amel, she's right. First, during the demonstrations, they excluded them. They didn't want them to. It's the French, as Mohammed said. It's the French they're wishing to see that, because the French supported the fifth mandate, the fifth term, as long as the regime could guarantee the security and as long as there would be no refugees and so on and so forth. So if you look at the results of the Islamists at the polls, they are very bad. They have been going down. And the Islamists themselves have changed. They have been transformed into more moderate parties, and but there has been on the and again you follow as much as I do. I think in terms of the society itself, social conservatism has grown. But the political parties, the Islamists, violent Islamist parties, these are things of the past in Algeria, in my humble view.
Okay. Last but not least, Dalia, please.
Yeah, well, when we think about Islamists in Algeria, we need to think about three types. So we have the radicals with the jihadists, and then we have the moderate with the parties, and then we had the mainstream Islamists in Algeria today that are Dawah Salafiyya. So when it comes to the jihadists, I can state today, very objectively speaking, that they have been crushed. After 10 years of civil war, today the jihadist violence in Algeria is very low, it is sporadic, and it is highly localized. When we talk about Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, it doesn't exist anymore in Algeria, it does exist in Mali, in Niger, in the Sahel, and it is much more active there. When we talk about the Islamic State in Algeria, it never existed. It was a publicity stunt more than a real threat. So when it comes to the jihadist violence, I would say it went from lethal in Algeria in the 90s to manageable today. And Algeria is a pretty safe country. Today, when we talk to Algerians, they would tell you, I feel safer in the street of Algiers than I would in Paris after Charlie Hebdo and so on and so forth. So this, when it comes to the extremist wing of it, it has been crushed, and the problem is almost solved. Of course, the risk zero doesn't exist. When it comes to the moderate, the Islamist party, as my colleague said, have been co-opted, and this was a smart move by the Algerian regime. They have been co-opted, and in this co-optation, they witness what is called un processus d'embourgeoisement, a gentrification process, because they took advantage of the oil and the rent revenues. Their interests are so high that they wouldn't like to challenge the regime. And the proof is that when the protests started in Algeria, the Islamists didn't wake up and said, oh, we are supporting the Algerians. As a matter of fact, many of them remained silent or said, no, 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 let's do things differently. When they joined the movement pretty late and they wanted to surf on the wave, people told them in the street, dégage, dégage, get out, the most The best example on that is Abdullah Jaballah and also Abdurrazaq Makri, who were ousted in the demonstration. So they are totally decredibilized in the eyes of Algerians who do not see them as real challenger. By the opposite, they see them as lackeys. They see them as, and the proof is that they call them Shiatin, which means lackeys, which means
brown noses.
Exactly. When it comes now to the mainstream Islamists, it is Dawah Salafiyya, and I cannot go on that. However, the network has been very strong, very powerful. You know, it is apolitical, and I do believe that it will remain apolitical in the sense that they wouldn't like to put against them during the transition the military or even the old guard of the regime or even the people. However, they are, you know, focusing on the Islamisation par le bas, if I may say. But of course, again, there is a lot of conservatism in Algeria, but being conservative doesn't mean being Islamist. Now, if I may, we need to think forward. What's next for Algeria? What should we do? As you may know, we have elections that are supposedly to be organized on 4th of July. There is less than 90 days to go. And I think the worst thing that can happen to Algeria right now is having elections. Because the question remains the same. For whom are we going to vote? We are going to vote for figures of Rumuz al-Nidam, for figures of the ancient, of the former regime, and this will give a chance to the regime for regenerating itself. So I don't think that elections are the answer right now in Algeria. And I think the best thing that we can have is to have a constituent assembly. Okay. And from that, we will have leaders that will emerge, and we can go forward with that.
Fantastic. Well, we've answered some questions, and we've raised a lot of more questions. Unfortunately, our time is done, but we actually have a reception outside. Well, I encourage you to come and ask our speakers further questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a fantastic, very rich evening that we had tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.